When it comes to Soviet tank designers, it is difficult to say that their names were undeservedly forgotten. One way or another, it is known under whose direction certain tanks, self-propelled artillery pieces, and wheeled armored vehicles were created. In this regard, Soviet tank design appears more honest than that of many foreign schools. Everyone knows who created the T-34 tank, but try to find out who was the chief designer of the German third model tank, the American medium tank M4, or the British Cromwell. In the history of Soviet tank building, there are several dozen names of those who either led design teams or were the leading engineers of a given vehicle. And it is precisely the leading engineer who is in fact the author of a tank. Another matter is that some figures, often key ones, were overshadowed by more well-known designers. Nikolai Fyodorovich Shashmurin belongs precisely to this category. Not everyone knows his name, yet his contribution to Soviet tank design is enormous. This talented engineer-designer was involved in most of the heavy tanks created in Leningrad. Over several decades, Shashmurin took part, in one way or another, in the development of several dozen combat vehicles. His greatest achievement was the creation of heavy tanks, or as he called them, tanks of ultimate parameters. The heavy tanks IS-1 and IS-2 were developed under his leadership as the leading engineer, meaning that Shashmurin himself is the author of these iconic machines. At the same time, Shashmurin is not as well known as, for example, Joseph Yakovlevich Kotin, with whom he had extremely difficult relations. In Soviet tank design of the pre-war and wartime periods, three main waves of designers can be traced. The first wave came in the early 1920s, when tanks were under the jurisdiction of the artillery branch, and designers often came from artillery or tractor manufacturing. This included, first and foremost, the team of the Technical Bureau of the main directorate of the military industry, Sergei Pavlovich Shukalov, Viktor Ivanovich Zaslavsky, Nikolai Vladimirovich Tsaich, and others. By the late 1920s, the second wave of designers began to emerge, those who had often graduated from specialized technical universities and consciously entered the field of tank construction. A classic example of a second-wave designer is Semyon Alexandrovich Ginzburg. The second wave also included such authoritative Soviet tank builders as Nikolai Alexandrovich Astrov, Nikolai Valentinovich Barikov, Nikolai Leonidovich Dukov, Nikolai Afanasievich Kucherenko, Alexander Alexandrovich Morozov, and Mikhail Ilyich Koshkin. As for Shashmurin, he became one of the many representatives of the third-wave design school. Although some of the third-wave engineers had graduated from universities in the early 1930s, their active work on tanks began only in the latter half of the decade. It was this generation of engineers that became the driving force which raised Soviet heavy tank design to a qualitatively new level. Most of those who would later form the core of the Special Design Bureau at the Kirov Plant were not born in Leningrad. In the case of Nikolai Fyodorovich, the situation was different. He came from a family of hereditary miners from the Ural region. His father, Fedor Ivanovich, had only 2 years of formal education, yet he was well-read and spent his entire life striving for knowledge. The turbulent beginning of the 20th century had a direct influence on Fedor Ivanovich. He participated in the Russo-Japanese War and, by a twist of fate, found himself in St. Petersburg, where he eventually settled. On June 26, 1910, his son Nikolai was born. Fedor Ivanovich also took part in the First World War, during which he was repeatedly decorated and suffered both shell shock and gas poisoning. By 1917, he had become a Bolshevik, participated in the revolutionary events, trained Red Guards in military affairs, and later repeatedly served as a deputy of the Petrograd and Leningrad Soviets. Despite his busy life, Fedor Ivanovich fully understood the importance of giving his son a proper education. Thus, Nikolai Shashmurin enrolled in Soviet Labor School No. 4, which was in fact the old Petrovskaya School, one of the oldest educational institutions in St. Petersburg, founded back in 1709. Despite the upheavals of the revolution, the former Petrovskaya School had retained its core of professors, and Nikolai received an excellent education. Nikolai Fyodorovich studied for a long time. After completing primary and secondary school, he entered a higher educational institution, the Leningrad Polytechnic Institute, named after Kalinin. In 1930, the institute was divided into several independent schools. Shashmurin joined the Leningrad Institute of Mechanization of Socialist Agriculture. Officially, it specialized in tractor construction, but in reality, it also trained specialists for factories producing tanks. Nikolai Fyodorovich became deeply interested in tank design. In addition to theoretical courses, students underwent practical training, for example, in the mechanized brigade named after Kalinovsky. Thus, Shashmurin had a solid understanding of what tanks were and how they worked. After graduating, he completed advanced courses for Red Army command personnel in Leningrad. Therefore, by June 1937, when Nikolai Fyodorovich Shashmurin began working at the design bureau of the Kirov Plant, he already possessed extensive knowledge which he quickly began applying in practice. The second half of the 1930s became an extremely difficult period for Soviet tank construction, and the Kirov Plant was no exception. The production program for medium tanks had failed for a variety of reasons, and a wave of repressions swept through the factory. Oleg Ivanovich Ivanov, the head of the design bureau, was arrested. In April 1937, Joseph Kotin was appointed to his place. Previously, he had worked at the Stalin Military Academy of Mechanization and Motorization, where he supervised several projects, including an aircraft deployment system for reconnaissance amphibious tanks. At that time, the design bureau was struggling to refine a new tank that was meant to replace the previous model. It was during the active phase of modernization that Shashmurin joined the bureau as a design engineer. The new version of the vehicle had become a true breakthrough tank, with properly angled armor plates and frontal armor nearly 2 inches thick, about 50 millimeters. The combat weight had increased to over 70,000 pounds, or 32 tons, which made the suspension issue critical. Around this time, news arrived from Sweden that a new Swedish tank featured a torsion-bar suspension, as it was called in the report. Developing a domestic version of the torsion-bar suspension became Shashmurin's first major task. However, the final version of the tank still retained a coil spring suspension. Playing it safe, Kotin chose the more conservative solution. This tank never went beyond drawings and documentation, but in 1938, work began on a new breakthrough tank. During its creation, the design bureau led by Kotin initially focused on a bogie suspension, derived from the heavy 5-turret tank. Nevertheless, Shashmurin managed to insist on his own version with torsion bars. It must be said that Kotin had his own solid reasons for wanting the bogie suspension. The fact was that the new tank with bogie suspension weighed about 121,000 pounds, or 55 tons, while with torsion bar suspension, it weighed approximately 125,000 pounds, or 57 tons. There were also production-related reasons. Even so, the torsion bar suspension was more promising, and the total travel of the road wheel was greater, almost 12 inches or 303 millimeters compared to 8 or 9 inches or 210 to 230 millimeters. At the beginning of 1939, an experimental model of the torsion bar suspension was tested on a medium tank, after which it was finally adopted as the standard suspension for the new breakthrough tank. All this was preceded by a fierce struggle between Kotin and Shashmurin. In the future, this conflict would evolve into a rivalry that lasted for decades. It is enough to say that Shashmurin was never awarded for his work on the new breakthrough tank. After that, work began on the design of the heavy KV tank. It was, so to speak, a half of the multi-turret SMK-1 tank. The work began by the decision of the Supreme Soviet on the 9th of December, 1938. The project was developed by fifth-year students of the Military Academy of Mechanization and Motorization, Semyon Mikhailovich Kasavin, Boris Petrovich Pavlov, Leonid Nikolaevich Pereverzev, Vladimir Konstantinovich Sinozersky, Georgy Alexandrovich Turchaninov, and Lev Shpuntov. In essence, they were bringing to life their diploma project dated October 1938. At first, Shashmurin was appointed as the project's leader, since it was believed that the SMK tank had priority. But in February 1939, when the preliminary version of the KV project was prepared, Shashmurin himself called it Kotin Voroshilov. The leadership of the work on the vehicle was transferred to Leonid Nikolaevich Dukov. Shashmurin developed a mechanical gearbox for the KV tank, but it was later replaced by the one created according to Dukov's design. This led to animosity between the two engineers. Shashmurin often accused Dukov of creating an unreliable gearbox that eventually destroyed the KV in its initial form. One way or another, the KV tank received Shashmurin's torsion bar suspension. and on the 19th of December 1939, the tank was officially adopted by the Red Army. Later, Shashmurin's torsion-bar suspension was installed on all Soviet heavy tanks and self-propelled artillery units. Starting with the KV tank, one of Shashmurin's main areas of work at the Special Design Bureau 2 became the development of gearboxes. At the same time, he also participated in the creation of the light tank K1 project, which later became the basis for the T-50 developed at the Kirov Plant. In the second half of 1940, work began on the heavy T-220 tank. For it, Shashmurin developed a new 5-speed gearbox. The development proved very timely since the combat weight of the T-220 exceeded 136,000 pounds, and the power of the V2SN engine reached 850 horsepower. The tank turned out to be unreliable, suffering from constant mechanical failures, but no problems were reported with the gearbox. It is no coincidence that this very gearbox was intended for use in the T-222, an improved variant of the T-150 tank, which in turn was to go into production as the KV-3. The same gearbox was also planned for another tank designated KV-3, whose development was carried out in the spring of 1941. Following the same scheme, a gearbox was also designed for the T-50 of the Leningrad Kirov Plant. Shashmurin's most specific work was the heavy tank KV-4. At first, this machine was supposed to weigh about 158,000 pounds, but it quickly became clear that it would not be possible to fit within that weight. A competition was held at the Kirov Plant, to which almost everyone from Special Design Bureau 2 was involved, including Shashmurin. The idea belonged to Joseph Kotin, and it was supported by the director of the Kirov Plant, Isaac Moiseyevich Zaltzman. Shashmurin himself approached this competition extremely negatively, but nevertheless took part in it. Later, he recalled his KV-4 project. When, together with other leading designers, I received the task to design a project for such a huge tank, which was required to be multi-turreted, I did not really believe in that multi-turret idea. After all, not long before, Soviet engineers had abandoned the multi-turreted tank concept that had been laid down in the heavy tank project. So I decided to act unconventionally. I completely abandoned turrets and did what I had once applied on the KV-1 when I installed a 6-inch howitzer. That is, I made an armored casemate on the hull of the tank. And since the new, practically super heavy tank KV-3 had already been created, I decided not to invent something entirely new. I removed its turret and repeated the previous variant, turning it into a self-propelled gun of great power by installing their Grabin's 4.2-inch gun. In the explanatory notes to the project, I indicated that under certain conditions the gun could be removed, and instead an infantry compartment could be placed in the combat compartment. This variant was not admitted to the competition because the conditions were not met. Stronger protection, tank weight 176,000 to 220,000 pounds, a turreted weapon mount with multiple turrets. To avoid unnecessary conflict, I went for a compromise. Believing that a super heavy tank could not be a true tank, I accepted the protection requirements, fit within a weight of about 198,000 pounds, kept an armored casemate for the main gun, and on the roof of the lowered casemate I installed a serial turret from the KV-1. It ended with Isaac Moiseyevich Zaltzman valuing this option very highly, considering its sensible, as he said, versatility. And I received the second prize in the amount of 1,000 rubles. That was wonderful. With that money, I bought my wife a fur coat. In reality, Shashmurin's project did not even take third place. First place was awarded to Duhov's project with a prize of 5,000 rubles, which was put into production. Second place went to the project of Kuzmin, Mitskovich, and Tarokko with a prize of 3,000 rubles. Third place went to Tsaits, and the same prize amount, in 2,000 rubles, was awarded to Yermolayev and Saikov. Shashmurin received a prize of 1,500 rubles. He himself called KV-4 and the subsequent KV-5 nothing other than an abbreviation for the delirium of a madman. This was very close to the truth, since even KV-3 was a rather dubious idea, and here we were talking about monsters weighing 187,000 to 220,000 pounds. They were not destined to be realized. The Great Patriotic War began, which changed the lives of millions of Soviet citizens, including Shashmurin. The beginning of the Great Patriotic War radically changed the plans for the creation and production of heavy tanks. The KV-4 and KV-5 projects were quickly terminated, although in fact Seitz's group continued to work on KV-5 until August 1941. The Kirov plant focused on the production of KV-1 tanks. At the same time, work on KV-3 was not closed. It was now planned to be developed in Chelyabinsk at the Chelyabinsk tractor plant. On June 30, 1941, the Kirov plant issued an order transferring 18 design engineers to Chelyabinsk, including Dukov, Pavlov, and Shashmurin. Along with the engineers and their families, a half-assembled KV-3 tank was loaded onto the train. However, soon there was no time for the KV-3. The Chelyabinsk tractor plant, renamed the Chelyabinsk Kirov plant, in the autumn of 1941, soon became the only place producing KV-1 tanks. Shashmurin, together with other Leningrad engineers, joined the design bureau of the plant, which was soon renamed SKB-2. The end of 1941 and the beginning of 1942 was a time of numerous independent design projects, and Chelyabinsk was no exception. For example, there they developed a raid vehicle based on the T-34 tank, capable of reaching a maximum speed of 43 miles per hour. Shashmurin, in turn, worked on a light tankette called People's Wrath. Unfortunately, no documentation of it survived. The combat vehicle, weighing 5,500 pounds, was to be equipped with machine gun armament, a power unit of 2 CHTZ S-65 tractor-starting engines, armor from 0.8 to 1 inch thick, and a crew of 2. The tankette was never built, and by spring 1942, Shashmurin found work in his direct specialty. The reason was that at the beginning of 1942, mass complaints began arriving about the gearboxes of KV-1 tanks. This was due both to declining production quality and to the overload of the vehicle, which already weighed around 110,000 pounds. On March 20, 1942, the State Defense Committee issued a decree demanding higher quality of engines and gearboxes used in KV-1 tanks. In practice, however, this coincided with the beginning of work on a new tank that would later become known as the KV-1s. Initially, the project involved a slightly lighter KV-1 with a more powerful engine and a new gearbox. To ensure success, development began on 2 gearboxes simultaneously. The first was created by Fyodor Alexandrovich Merishkin. The second was designed by Shashmurin himself. His gearbox, an 8-speed, was based on the transmission he had once designed for the T-220 tank. By that time, he was already working at Experimental Plant No. 100, organized within the Chelyabinsk facility. Tests, which began in the 20s of April 1942, showed that Shashmurin's gearbox proved more successful. It was officially approved in mid-June. In practice, the KV-1S tank, for which Mikhail Fyodorovich Balzy served as lead engineer, turned out to differ significantly from the original concept. In addition to the new gearbox, the tank received a lightened hull, the configuration of which was modified compared to the KV-1. Moreover, the suspension system was substantially redesigned, which also helped reduce the vehicle's overall weight. Finally, the tank received a new turret, the design of which echoed another Chelyabinsk development, the KV-13. Development of this vehicle began in March 1942. It was intended as a radical replacement for the heavy KV-1 tank. Engineers sought to combine the strong armor of a heavy tank with the maneuverability and size of a medium one. Despite this, the KV-13, whose chief engineer was Nikolai Fyodorovich Shashmurin, remained a heavy tank. At Plant No. 100, the vehicle was even referred to as the IS-7. It so happened that development of this tank had to be temporarily suspended in favor of another model, the KV-1S. Furthermore, on July 3rd, the government signed a decree on the production of T-34 and T-70 tanks. According to this decree, the Chelyabinsk tractor plant was to begin manufacturing the T-34. As a result, the future of the KV-13 became highly uncertain. For Seitz, the events surrounding his project were the final blow. On July 19, 1942, he died of a heart attack in Shashmurin's arms. Shashmurin directly blamed Kotin, the plant director, with whom the aging engineer had had a difficult conversation shortly before. One way or another, after Seitz's death, Shashmurin became the chief engineer of the KV-13 project. The tank that came to Shashmurin as an inheritance plainly did not please him. In his memoirs, Nikolai Fyodorovich believed that the KV-13 had been almost an attempt to replace the T-34, but that was not the case. At the same time, the idea of a heavy tank in the dimensions of a medium tank proved to be wrong. Moreover, in its current form, the KV-13 no longer satisfied the military leadership because it had a two-man turret instead of a three-man one. The prototype was built in the second half of September 1942, and on the 26th it went out for trials. The vehicle was too raw, and its running gear proved too weak. During one of the tests, Shashmurin himself sat at the controls. He treated the tank without ceremony, and as a result, part of the road wheels were damaged. A scandal erupted, and it became increasingly obvious that the KV-13 in its present form had no future. From November 1942, work began on a reworked KV-13, which was already Shashmurin's creation. There, Nikolai Fyodorovich implemented his ideas, including an 8-speed gearbox, which now worked in tandem with the planetary steering mechanisms of the design by Alexander Ivanovich Blahon-Ravov. The tank grew noticeably heavier. Its combat weight was now 81,500 pounds instead of 70,500 pounds. The turret returned to being three-man, and instead of the 76mm IS-7 gun, they installed the F-34, which occupied less space in the fighting compartment. In addition to the new solutions, the second variant of the KV-13 showed the influence of the KV-1s, which had entered serial production in August 1942. The lightened KV proved notably more maneuverable and more reliable than its predecessor, but it lost significantly in armor protection. Therefore, Shashmurin's creation began to be considered as a potential replacement for the KV-1s. On February 24, 1943, Stalin, at the proposal of Zaltzman, who at that time was People's Commissar of the tank industry, signed a government decision to produce experimental samples of IS tanks. Thus, work on the IS-1 was accelerated, and the IS-2, with a turret resembling the KV-9 and a 122mm U-11 gun, was added to it. The first IS-1 prototype was ready by March 8, 1943. The vehicle proved more reliable than its predecessor, but a number of problems appeared. The running gear with 5 road wheels was already a bit weak for such mass, and there were problems with the cooling system. At first, it was assumed that the tank would soon go into serial production, but test results showed that this would be premature. The final blow to the second variant of the KV-13 was the appearance of the German heavy tank Tiger. Ballistic tests on the captured sample, which took place at the end of April 1943, showed that the 76mm IS-5 and F-34 guns did not penetrate the German newcomer even in the flank, at a distance of 656 feet. Work was urgently launched to create more powerful armament of an 85mm caliber. These efforts were conducted in close cooperation with the Chelyabinsk tractor plant, and it very quickly became clear that the IS-1 turret was too small for such a system. The turret ring diameter needed to be expanded to 67 to 71 inches. Of course, there were attempts to mount an 85mm gun in a turret with the standard diameter, but they proved pointless. In May 1943, work began on a new tank. The leading engineer of the vehicle remained Shashmurin, who was consistently transforming the previous model into a full-fledged heavy tank. The combat weight, by calculation, was already 95,000 to 97,000 pounds, and the maximum speed was estimated at approximately 25 miles per hour. In the new tank, the second variant of the previous model was easily recognized, but it was significantly reworked. The hull became longer, the number of road wheels increased to 6, and the problems revealed during the March-April 1943 trials were taken into account. The turret became larger, and the diameter of the turret ring grew to 71 inches. At the end of May 1943, the new tank began to be called IS-3, but soon the name was shortened to IS. At the same time, Shashmurin, as the lead engineer, worked on another model, an attempt to install a new 85mm S-31 gun in the standard turret of the previous tank. As the test showed, the idea of mounting this weapon was feasible, but the work of the turret crew proved to be too cramped. Moreover, the S-31 itself turned out to be an unsuccessful system. Initially, both tank variants were equipped with S-31 guns, but later, the first prototype received an 85mm D5T gun. As for the driving performance of the new tank, the very first test showed that the machine was a success. The average pure driving speed reached 14 miles per hour, and overheating problems disappeared. Later, the average speed increased even more. The new tank clearly appeared more promising than the previous model, but since time was needed to master its production, on August 8, 1943, Stalin signed a decree on the production of KV tanks with 85mm guns. This vehicle was adopted as the KV-85. The tank, whose lead engineer was Mikhail Fyodorovich Balzy, represented a reworked version of the previous model fitted with the same turret as the new heavy tank. As a result, the vehicle became heavier, but was more quickly mastered by the factory. On this basis, Zaltzman proposed to launch the modernized KV-85 into mass production instead of the new model. However, this project met a strong rejection from Vyacheslav Alexandrovich Malyshev, who in the summer of 1943 had returned to his post as People's Commissar of the tank industry. It was obvious that Shashmurin's creation had greater potential. On September 4, 1943, Stalin signed a decree on the production of IS tanks. The new tank was adopted by the Red Army as the IS-85 or IS-1. Production of the IS-1 at the Chelyabinsk plant began in November 1943, but it did not remain in series for long. The reason was that as early as May 1943, work had begun on installing more powerful armament, the D-25T, into the new IS. This system, with a caliber of 122mm, was based on the ballistics of the A-19 core gun, which had proven to be the most effective weapon against the German Tiger during testing. Work on the D-25T was accelerated in the summer of 1943, and by the end of September, an experimental sample of the gun was mounted on the second tank prototype. This machine, also supervised by Shashmurin, was renamed. During testing, it turned out that the idea of installing a more powerful weapon had fully justified itself. On October 31, 1943, Stalin signed a decree on the heavy IS-2 tank with a 122mm gun. According to the decree, the production of the first tanks of this type was to begin as early as December 1943. The machine received the designation IS-2, and compared to the experimental prototype, its turret was slightly refined. Undoubtedly, the IS-2 tank became the pinnacle of Shashmurin's creative work. It was the first Soviet heavy tank that unquestionably surpassed medium tanks in terms of armament power. Later, there were attempts to mount the same gun on a medium tank, but the tests showed that such a gun was too large for a medium vehicle. The IS-2 became the main Soviet heavy tank of 1944 to 1945, and one of the tanks of victory. Based on the IS tank, an entire series of self-propelled artillery units under the name ISU was created. Shashmurin also played a major role in the development of the KV-1S tank. For this work, he received the Stalin Prize of the second degree in 1943. The higher-level award, the Stalin Prize of the first degree for the IS tank, came to him later in 1946. At the end of 1943, Shashmurin had the opportunity to become the chief designer of the Chelyabinsk Kirov Plant, but he declined the offer. Nikolai Fyodorovich was more interested in creating new tanks than working as, essentially, a manager. At that time, Chelyabinsk was engulfed in a quiet confrontation between several factions. A silent war was underway between the Chelyabinsk Kirov Plant and Plant No. 100, and by the end of 1943, under the leadership of Nikolai Leonovich Dukov, work had begun on a new generation of heavy tanks. Meanwhile, at Plant No. 100, efforts were launched to deeply modernize the IS-2 tank. It turned out that the frontal armor protection was insufficient. This was due to the stepped front hull section, which, like the driver's viewing hatch, Kotin continued to defend. Shashmurin, on the other hand, promoted the idea of a straightened front hull plate, a view also supported at the proving ground of the Research Armored Institute. Malyshev agreed with this decision as well. In March 1944, Shashmurin developed a project for a deeply modernized IS-2, essentially a new tank, with the fighting compartment placed at the rear. It became one of Shashmurin's last projects in Chelyabinsk. On May 26, 1944, Stalin signed a decree on the organization of IS tank production, their armored hulls, and on the restoration of metallurgy at the Kirov and Izhora plants of the People's Commissariat of the tank industry in Leningrad. The second clause ordered the establishment of a branch of Plant No. 100 at its old location, and the revival of the Special Design Bureau of the Kirov Plant. Together with a number of other designers, Shashmurin returned to Leningrad, where the plant had to be revived almost from scratch. At that moment, he became the head of the restored Special Design Bureau. The decision to return to Leningrad was twofold. On one hand, Shashmurin was free from Kotin's influence, with whom his relationship had remained strained. On the other hand, Nikolai Fyodorovich temporarily fell out of the process of creating the new generation of heavy tanks. He managed to take part in the IS-6 project, but in the next round of rivalry between Plant No. 100 and the Chelyabinsk Kirov Plant, Dukov and Balzy prevailed with their project Kirovets 1, the same modernization of the IS-2 demanded by the main armored directorate of the Red Army. Shashmurin spoke unfavorably of this tank, later adopted as the IS-3. He considered it a half measure and believed a new tank of ultimate parameters was required. However, creating an entirely new tank required time, and the unsuccessful experience with another project, the IS-4, adopted on April 26, 1946, demonstrated that the IS-3 was the better solution. It was less protected but lighter, and used many components from the IS-2. The rush to launch the tank into series production led to numerous problems that had to be solved even after production ended. Nevertheless, the IS-3 proved to be a successful tank. Meanwhile, the Kirov plant was mastering production of the heavy IS-2 tank, though only 10 such machines were delivered in total. Production of the ISU-152 self-propelled gun, however, went much better. In Leningrad, they were built until 1947. At the same time, peacetime projects were also underway, most notably the KT-12 forest tractor, developed from a German-Austrian artillery prime mover. The order to create it had been received back in the spring of 1944. Using the German design as a foundation, the Kirov plant engineers built their own version. As deputy chief designer, Shashmurin initially played one of the key roles in developing the KT-12. This continued until 1946, when Malyshev, who had by then become Minister of Transport Engineering, instructed him to switch to another purely military project. In early 1945, at Plant No. 100, work began on developing a new generation of heavy tank. It was designated as IS-7. The vehicle was created jointly with a research institute, which gave it a rather unusual hull and turret design. The V-shaped hull bottom initially forced the designers to abandon the torsion-bar suspension, replacing it with a blocked one, but later the torsion bars returned to the IS-7. By the end of 1945, work had started on the main version of the tank. For this version, Shashmurin devised a bundled torsion bar suspension. Instead of a single long torsion bar, several shorter ones were installed, making the structure more compact. In addition, the bundled torsion bars proved to be more effective. Shashmurin also developed an ejector-type cooling system, which turned out to be more efficient, and proposed a different gearbox design. Finally, he oversaw the project's overall technical direction as well as the general layout of the tank. During the creation of the final and most advanced version of the vehicle, Shashmurin became its lead engineer. Interestingly, he was personally appointed to this position by Kotin. The IS-7 turned out to have an unfortunate fate. The tank was too heavy, complex, and expensive. There had already been a negative experience with the IS-4, which weighed about 132,000 pounds. Slightly lighter, but no less problematic. Therefore, in February 1949, an order was issued to cease work on the IS-7, and its design solutions were to be used in a new tank. Shashmurin was removed from this new project, which was jointly developed by the design bureaus of Chelyabinsk and Leningrad. The resulting tank, accepted into service as the T-10, was considered by Shashmurin himself to be unsuccessful. In his view, it was necessary to create a tank with a combat weight of about 128,000 pounds, incorporating the maximum possible developments from the previous model. However, the Ministry of Transport Machine Building thought quite differently, and it is hard to say they were wrong. The T-10 turned out to be a successful tank, which, by the way, made extensive use of earlier innovations. The bundled torsion bars, the ejector cooling system, and even the hull design were all closely related to the IS-7. As for Shashmurin, his experience was later applied to the creation of an entirely different type of tank, an amphibious vehicle that was soon renamed. On its basis, an armored personnel carrier was developed simultaneously. These combat vehicles became known as the PT-76 and the BTR-50. Both of them featured not only the ejector cooling system, but also water jets designed by Shashmurin. Later, Nikolai Fyodorovich served as the lead engineer of these vehicles, perfecting them as they entered serial production. On the basis of the BTR-50, he developed several variants, one of which became the Antarctic all-terrain vehicle, Penguin. The 1950s and 1960s became a period of new projects for Shashmurin. Despite not being directly involved with the T-10, heavy tanks remained one of his main fields of interest. Between 1955 and 1957, he supervised the creation of a new generation heavy tank, as well as another heavy model. He was also directly involved in developing a completely new type of combat vehicle, a heavy rocket tank destroyer. Moreover, Nikolai Fyodorovich had a direct role in the subsequent Leningrad missile tanks. He also worked on installing gas turbine engines in tanks and other machines. At the same time, all these vehicles remained experimental. His true success turned out to be not a tank or a launcher, but a wheeled tractor. Starting in 1959, Shashmurin became one of the leading developers of the Kirovets K700 wheeled tractor, which, in various versions, was produced for 40 years. From 1937 to 1969, Nikolai Fyodorovich took part in the development of more than 30 different combat vehicles, not counting the KT-12 tractor, the K700, and other machines designed for peaceful purposes. Later, he worked on the Museum of the Design Bureau at the Kirov Plant, where many unique materials were collected. Shashmurin also gave lectures at the Leningrad Polytechnic Institute, and in 1974, he received the degree of Doctor of Technical Sciences. Yet, the strained relationship with Kotin never disappeared. One could say that Kotin's final act of revenge was the destruction of the Kirov Plant Design Bureau Museum in January 1979. Shashmurin managed to save what he could, organizing his own museum in Kuzhenkino. Much of what Shashmurin preserved later appeared in publications by authors who studied and continue to study Soviet armored vehicles. In their lifelong rivalry, Shashmurin ultimately outlived Kotin. The latter died in 1979, while Nikolai Fyodorovich survived him by 17 years. One of Shashmurin's greatest merits was his willingness to share his knowledge with those who knew him in his later years. Grandfather, as he was called by those close to him, was a fascinating conversationalist. In 1987, he prepared his memoirs titled 50 Years of Struggle. Like many other memoirs, it contained certain inaccuracies, but most of the facts corresponded well with archival materials. The memoirs turned out to be rather harsh, but there were reasons for that. They faithfully reflected the atmosphere of Soviet tank design at the time. There is no doubt that the man who created the IS-2 tank had every right to his own point of view. And for the materials on Soviet tank development that survived thanks to Nikolai Fyodorovich, many generations of researchers will express their deep gratitude to him.